Good afternoon. Welcome back. Doug Pagitt Radio, May 1st, 2011, Hour 2. If you're familiar with the rhythm of our show, you know that quite often in Hour 2, we like to have a longer conversation, 20 minutes or so, with an author, with a thought leader, with someone who's suggesting a new way to think about ideas of religion, spirituality, science, health, those kinds of things in our world. And I'm pleased to be joined by John Newman. John has written a book called The Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in Light of Yogic Mysticism. And if you've ever wondered what the connection, what the interplay, what the relationship should be between Christianity, teachings of Jesus, and Eastern mysticism, you are not alone, because a lot of people wonder about these things. There's a lot of us who feel like, boy, the way the church has told the story of Jesus and the way that a lot of us want to experience our spirituality are so different. Well, John has written a book where he's tried to address some of these issues, and I'm pleased to have him with us. John, thanks for being on the show with us.
My pleasure to be with you.
So this is an interesting book, especially for someone of your background, because your background is not in religion per se. Well, you have a PhD in Far Eastern history, but you've spent much of your professional life working for the U.S. Army and the National Security Agency.
That's correct.
Yeah. So how does someone with your pedigree and with your background end up writing a book about the historic Jesus and the connection of the teachings of Jesus to yogic mysticism? How did that come about for you?
In stages, briefly. At some point, I became very interested in the Old Testament because, as you know, Kings, Chronicles, Jeremiah, long sections of the Old Testament have a lot of history in it.
Right.
But I didn't do so much work there, but enough to understand something about the Bible. I grew up as a Lutheran. My parents moved overseas, and that was the end of that when I was about 7 or 8.
Right.
Anyway, way downstream, about the time I retired from the Army, I began practicing yoga. And I became very fascinated with it and read a lot of yogic scriptures. I had done a lot of that by the time the story broke 5 years ago in April, almost exactly 5 years ago, about the Gospel of Judas.
Mm-hmm.
The story at the time, National Geographic had got hold of it and had a big documentary, and it was in the news and newspapers on television that Judas was a good guy because Jesus told him to turn him in. Right. That was sort of the headline at the time. There was a subtext, though, at the National Geographic website about the Gospel of Thomas. So I went back to my Gospel of Thomas, and the difference in me in those 8 years or so was that I had become a yogi and understood yogic mysticism and read a lot of scripture. I opened up the Gospel of Thomas. The very first saying attributed to Jesus is basically the limbs of yoga. I kept reading. There's only 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. Newly found, by the way, in 1945. And my jaw hit the table, basically. I checked around to look for what had been done on Jesus' mysticism. Not a whole lot. Mostly by Marcus Borg and a few others, but no one had actually tried to seriously make the connection between the mysticism of yoga and Jesus. And so that's what I spent the last 5 years doing.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because, I hang around a lot of people who do yoga. My wife is a yoga instructor and does that kind of thing. But for most people who know their Christianity and do yoga, mostly what people say is, look, they're not against each other, right? Like there's nothing that would keep you from doing yoga as a person who would be a follower of Jesus. But you're making a greater suggestion. You're actually saying, oh, hang on, it's not just that they're not in competition. They actually have a whole lot more in common. And if you were to listen to Jesus' teachings through the lens of yogic understanding, you would see something new. Do I have you right on that?
You do, indeed.
Yeah. So you're not just saying, hey, don't worry about the competition between the two. You're saying spend a little more time thinking about Jesus as the kind of leader and teacher and religious entrepreneur through the lens of Eastern mysticism and yoga.
Yes, especially Jesus, the wisdom prophet, and Jesus, the healer. Mm-hmm. Those areas are very fascinating when you spend the time, and I think we're at the point now. There's enough information, enough new finds, discoveries. There's a new one, as you may have heard, a few weeks ago in Jordan. They found some interesting first-century material. It'll probably take a while. But anyway, I think we're at the point now where you don't have to go to seminary to start to figure this stuff out.
Oh, interesting. Now, what do your parents think about all this if they raised you a Lutheran before they moved? Or what would your Lutheran Sunday school teachers have thought?
Well, my parents became atheists at some point.
Oh, they did, huh?
Yes, and I'm sorry to say neither of them are here, but my mother used to joke with me. She'd say, you'd make a good priest. So I've often wondered how she would have reacted to this book.
And what do you hear from other people in the religious circles? Because I can imagine that they're. I mean, I hear enough trouble from people who say, "Look, if you even practice yoga or think it's okay, you're in trouble." Let alone the suggestion you're making that we should think about Jesus through the lens of Eastern mysticism and yoga.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of misconceptions about yoga. Your wife will tell you that it's not Hinduism. The Hindus have claimed it and used it for their purposes, but it's been around longer than Hinduism. And it's anathema to polytheism. The spirituality of yoga, Isvara, is fully cognate with the God of the Jews, the Christians, and Muslims. And it is utterly egalitarian, which is not exactly what's going on in Indian society. We're very fortunate that yoga was preserved for many thousands of years there, but does not mean that that's where it originated.
Oh, that's an interesting argument. I hadn't heard that before. So I had heard that that yoga was one of the religious practices and innovations of Hinduism. But you're saying that no, they also picked it up along the way, but it was around in human spirituality well before that.
Yes, going back at least 5,000 years. It's very interesting. The Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata, one of the most treasured Indic scriptures, is a little different theologically than the Mahabharata. It is very monotheistic, and it makes the claim that yoga had deteriorated. In other words, that there was an archaic yoga that changed over time in India. So basically, if I could condense this point and compare it to what happened to the teachings of Jesus, you're probably familiar with what happened after he was executed. Things were changed and added to and deleted because those changes or additions or whatever met the needs of those early Christian communities. Well, the same thing happened to yoga over a much longer period of time as the Brahmin caste that was responsible for scribing and preserving Hindu teachings took and used and changed what they wanted to suit their needs in much the same way that happened to the Gospels.
Now, part of what you're arguing for in the book, and again, the book is called Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in Light of Yogic Mysticism. You're trying to make some arguments that heaven is not an afterlife experience and that human spirituality has a certain path that it can follow. And you're really, by suggesting those things, have you thought through yet what kind of Christian communities would need to be formed in order to narrate and allow people to participate in these?
Yeah, it's a very
question.
interesting practices? I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Marcus Borg, but he's been talking about this in his books for quite some time.
Yeah.
He's gone Episcopalian and has really made the argument that we're at a crossroads here at the heart of Christianity, and that's true. But I can't let that drive my research or what I find. When you look at the Gospel of Thomas and even the Gospel of Luke 17:22, in which Luke says, "Heaven is within you," well, that kind of stands as some sort of foreign icon when you think about all the apocalyptic sayings attributed to Jesus in the canon. But still, in Luke, you find this strange statement, and then when we get to the Gospel of Thomas, it's all over the place. It's the opening to the gospel. It's the closing to the gospel. It's in the middle of the gospel. It's not just something out of place. And so the Gospel of Thomas caused a huge amount of debate beginning in the 70s and 80s. It's still going on.
Yeah.
But in the United States, those biblical scholars that have seriously thought about this have been moving in the direction of a consensus that Thomas is early and it's authentic and has the greatest amount of material that we can trace back to the historical Jesus. In Europe, they're playing catch-up over there. The consensus is still the other way, mainly being driven by the Protestant and Catholic theologians over there.
Now, how much familiarity or commonality do you find in the Jesus as a mystic teacher in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that are inside of the canonical scriptures? There's
plenty there. The problem is they're later, and there have been more changes. As you know, Mark was written in the 60s. Matthew and Luke are in the 90s. John is about 110 CE. The Gospel of Thomas is probably written in the 40s. There's another gospel we haven't seen, but we know about because Matthew and Luke borrowed from, called Sayings Gospel Q. That comes from the 50s. Gospel of the Hebrews, we don't have too much, but it's in the 50s. When you go back to these very, very early gospels, you get an entirely different vision or mix of visions of Jesus and his teachings than you do when you read gospels that were written at the end, very late first century.
Yeah, now we're going to take a break here for commercials, but when we come back, I want to ask you a little bit about that because I know it's a crucial point for people who look at the historic Jesus. So I want to ask you about people who argue, no, hang on a minute. You know, these other gospels are actually the later written ones and are much more influenced by a kind of Greek Gnosticism than the earlier gospels. So I don't want to, totally bore the audience who doesn't want to do our historical critical stuff, but I think it's an interesting kind of conversation about how people make those connections and what the importance of that is. So can we talk about that when we come back here after the break? Okay, so I'm in a conversation here with John Newman. His book is called Quest for the Kingdom: The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism. There's a lot to this conversation. It's a conversation that people have in a variety of circles. So this might be new to you as a listener, or it might be something that you're quite familiar with. But either way, I would encourage you can go to Doug Pagitt Radio Facebook page, and we'll give you a link to John's websites and also where you can buy the book on Amazon. The book is Quest for the Kingdom: The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism. We'll be back here with John Newman talking more about this on Doug Pagitt Radio, religious radio that's not quite right, broadcasting out of the Twin Cities on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and DougPagittRadio.com.
And the men who hold high places must be the ones who start to mold a new reality closer to the heart, closer to the heart.